Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Dr. Melanie Meng Xue. Melanie, how do you pronounce your last name again?
Oh, and it is Xuan. Yeah, you did it right.
Yeah, oh, good, great. I know that some people can be sensitive about their name. So, Melanie, you are on fire. I read your paper titled Autocratic Rule and the Social Capital, Evidence from Imperial China. What's an autocracy, Melanie?
Yeah, so I'm glad you like the paper, but yeah, so for our purpose, I mean, I have strong interest in studying autocracy. I mean, you ask what is autocracy. So, if in a modern day context, so we think of this as Maoist China or Stalin time and Russia. And actually, the most typical type of autocracy would be imperial autocracy, and this is what I study in this paper.
Imperial autocracy, yes. So, Melanie, your argument is that there is a relationship between autocratic rule and social capital. And in your study, you listed several variables. But before we get to the nitty gritty of your study, please remind us, Melanie, the literary Inquisition. Comment on it. What was that?
Well, I mean, so in my work, it is looking at a pretty specific context, but obviously, as you mentioned, I wanted to be able to shed light on a more general principle, or general relationship between autocratic rule and social capital. So I started with looking at this episode of the literary inquisitions, which is basically how individuals gets persecuted for issues related to speech. So it would be any speech that is deemed as offensive or potentially for the purpose of treason. I think it's important to recognize that ultimately they punish the speech is because they worry about a speech can be used to incite rebellions or other more harmful behavior, at least in the context of China. So I study literary inquisitions and as a classic episode of political repression that was in autocracy, and then I show that by as an outcome as a consequence of having those repression being imposed on the ordinary people, but also the local elites, then the society as a whole end up with less trust and less social capital, which then become a condition for a more entrenched autocratic rule down the road.
On page 12, Melanie, I will be sharing this snippet for our listeners. A writer's descendant. In 1730, a literary inquisition case brought to light the the writings, and his name is Qudajun. How do you pronounce that?
You're on the 12 page.
Yes. Yes, for I want to share an example with the for the listeners.
I see. So let me get on the. I assume you are having my web page opened. Is
Yes.
that right? Okay. So I'll go to the 17
Because I'm
page.
an English speaker, his name looks like Q de Jean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're uh looking at the example of victim to the Lecture Inquisition case.
Yes,
Is that right? Yeah.
yes,
Um. So you're looking at Zhen. Is that the Liu Zhenyu? Is that the petitioner case, or
yes,
plus that,
yes. A
or
writer's descendant in 1730.
a righteous descendant?
Yeah, it's under that caption.
Okay, a righteous descendant. Yeah, yeah. So that's Chu Dajun. So that's it's a good case. It's a case. It's a good case to bring up because he's one of those loyalists that had this. Yeah, it's a case of having an unusually harsh and determined pursuit, right, from the point of view of the rulers. So the reason I think this was get used as an example, I think, is because it says several things. One is you have this Dajun, that's his name. So initially it was because of the being the Ming loyalist. So along with many other Ming loyalists, he died a tragic death. And then what's shocking, I think, right, because being a loyalist who behave or had the different views upon the state and getting punished is a lot less surprising than his dissidents who also was punished, but for very much of a much more tangential reasons. Right? So when his son, in this case, he was he was again his son decided even without any of the requests, they decided to turn himself in for possessing those books, which is actually extremely common during this time period. So people would be similar to the Cultural Revolution. People would take initiative when they're trying to establish themselves on a better terms with the state. Doesn't always result in a better situation for themselves. And in this case, I think even more striking that is even the more distant relatives were still punished, right? But admittedly, this is the later incident was during a more of the peak of the later persecutions in the 1770s to the 1780s. So that is how the later the more distant relatives were also punished for reasons related to their great grandfathers. Yeah.
Melanie, what motivated the Inquisition?
So from the point of view of the state, right, the rulers, I think this has to go all the way back to having those literati being a very central piece of the political institutions. So instead of having the Western European model, which you had the lords and share the power, I mean, at the earlier point, and then they had the king. Sometimes they emerged out of the system, as basically being the person that is more capable of violence. But the Chinese state were able to get rid of much of that in the earlier period. I think about by 1000 AD, it's mostly gone. And then instead, they use this exam system to select officials, but then as a byproduct, that there is also a local gentry. So in this constant process, then those people who were, had a good command of this, like both the literacy or the classic literature, they enjoy a substantial amount of respect and the soft power in the local society. So what they believe and what they decided to talk about then have a disproportional impact on the rest of the society. So for that reason, I think the ruler who was initially an outsider, right, to the local society in China, was very desperate in trying to having joined this alliance with those local elites. But it wasn't as successful as it wanted to be because they obviously had very different have the different backgrounds, shared the very different traditions. So it wasn't as easy to resolve. So even after years of hundreds and decades of efforts, there was still a substantial gap between what the local elites or the literati wanted and what the emperor wanted. So against this background, I think it was just very much of a right for the ruler. It is just a clever move, right, for his point of view and trying to monitor their behavior as much as possible. But then what they decided to do, because those are literati and the literati are, their strength is being able to produce writings and then deliver speech. So these are becoming natural targets. So instead of monitoring their actual political actions, which by this point is probably mostly eliminated and not really allowed to be existent anymore, but the ruler decided to mostly pursue in their literary activity, if we put it this way. So this includes any books they possess and just like anything they discussed with their friends, like if there is anyone report them, then including the cases you just saw on page 12.
Melanie, I find it striking that in your paper you note, I find it no evidence that the impact of literary inquisitions was confined to members of the elite, as measured by holders of the highest level degree, or to members of the gentry more broadly. Why would ordinary people be affected by the Inquisition?
Yeah, so this actually goes back to my earlier question. I think this is kind of a situation in China. I do think it is kind of unusual. I mean, it has a lot to do with the communist society. So instead of having those as a hereditary elite, in which case you think those are going to be much more stratified, and the elites will be mostly communicate with each other. But what China has is this system of having this access. I have another paper on this actually about how you use this examination system to stab the bureaucracy. So given this to be true, I think it's just going to be very hard to imagine the equivalent of having very much of like uh, um, distinct values just based on like specific social class or class, stratified by the wealth. It's just a very different system in that sense. And then just given like a more tangible example, like for these values or to those beliefs to spread, it can either be through just genetic transmission, because the rich, or not the rich, the successful candidates, they were reproducing at a higher rate. So even just through that, it can started to have their values they get eventually to spread through the whole population, not even taking very long. But then it's also just through this activity of like bottom up organization, having those exam takers and going through the exams with all these other people who take the exams. They're going to eventually share very similar values. I think Alman wrote a very good piece on this, like, describing the social functions of the exam system, which basically says it is such an effective tool to just like integrate members of a society into um, this structure that they're going to endlessly bringing in new outsiders or other more far away parts of the societies into this centralized bureaucracy. So I think through this process, this is how the whole country eventually shares like similar values as well. So for the emperor, therefore, it is very effective if you just can target even initially just like a small segment of the societies, but eventually this is going to be seen by the rest of the society who wanted to become them and do have a chance to become them. I don't know if yeah. So that's I think a simple way to put this is because there is no clear line between the so-called political elites and the ordinary people, and so therefore you couldn't really you can have a stable outcome, a stable equilibrium in which the two groups share different values. You'll have to be become the one just through this process of having examinations.
Exactly. And you provide confirmation for what you have been seeing in the explanation. And I'm just sharing this part of the essay so that our listeners can be motivated to go and read it. And you're right. I also find it no decline in the formation of top-down organizations, such as the government-sponsored academies that train the candidates for the exams. Obviously, if the government is training candidates for the exams, then politicians are going to support their organizations and their henchmen. So the literary inquisition would not necessarily stop the creation of intellectual organizations that are supported by the government.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is mostly just to because there's different ways to interpret this outcome or results. There are people who think, wouldn't this just be that the government simultaneously perform inquisitions but also like reduces investments in the locality? But here, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that this is not something the government decided to do, and they have the same amount of investment in all those other facilities as before, as long as it benefited them. Whereas I think the charities, which was the outcomes I do look at, it is mostly an organization that is sponsored or funded locally by the private individuals. So those are like different outcomes, and I like to make the point very clear. So it's not
Yeah,
about the government like curtail its investment and wanted to starve the local areas, which could be another strategy. Yeah.
yes. I was planning to ask you about charities. How did the literary inquisition affect the formation of charities?
Yeah. So here I use these charities is mostly for the purpose to measure social capital. So the way I think this has to be linked to like the social capital literature. Like, in order to measure social capital, there's several ways ideally you wanted to measure the level of the trust. But here I think charities are a very good, like, almost the second best measure of the social capital, because it provides a summary measure of what we can create and if we can cooperate with each other. So charities is the end outcome of how much of the ability and how much cooperation there exists in the society. I just think about how you set up a charity, and it's not clear, especially the kind of charity you have in pro China. It's not something you can actually personally benefited from, right? Other than like having a better reputation locally. But because these people they're not really politically competitive, because this is not a democracy, for obvious reasons. So then they don't really derive the other kind of benefits from setting up charities. So for that reason, I think even compared to in other circumstances where charities are also used as a measure of social capital, in the case of Imperial China, it really is a very good proxy for social capital, and that is why I've looked at the charities for the time period where this data is available and no other better measures of social capital can be used.
Melanie, I want you to go and research this topic. When I interview people who talk about social capital, I keep saying to them, the Americans are known for building research organizations. So obviously social capital in America is still relatively high. There are just so many
Yeah,
research
I think that's
organizations.
yeah. Mm.
And
I
that's what
agree with you that I think the book on this is just to describe a declining trend, but it doesn't really speak to the level. I mean, I do think, if you just look at those like honesty experiments, which is not entirely social capital, but it's related. I mean, in U.S., the UK, they're still among some of the highest ranked countries.
yeah, I'm always amazed. There are just so many networks in America, networks for venture capital, networks for people who want to hug each other. The country is rich in social capital. And I'm interested in social capital because I'm from the Caribbean and the Caribbean is low in social capital and trust.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Melanie,
That's right. Mm.
so on the topic of the literary inquisition, we're saying that it negatively affected the formation of charities and the social capital. But what about education and the budget for education? Because I read your paper and you did say that there's a link between autocracy, the literary inquisition, and the spending on education.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, it pretty much has to depend on how the funds are raised, right? So that's like a big precondition. So I think that's why much of the results and for the 20th century China was mostly broken down into two parts. One is when this an educational spending is all raised locally, then it is very much of a function of the social capital. And that is like the main way for the literary inquisitions to affect the education. So in my paper, whereas this other situation when it was more centralized, then I think results seems to suggest that if the government like just decided to take over, it can do it. I mean, there will be costs, right? There's literature on what is the cost of just doing things in a centralized way. But I do show that there is a one way to do it when decentralized options are becoming less effective due to having low social capital. Then sometimes instead you're having the government doing it in their own way. You can still at least making sure there is enough spending in it. I think that's how then later there's further implications of this literary inquisition, which is it makes it even harder over time to organize things locally and in a decentralized way. This is like one of the constraints it puts on the economy.
And this remark is also related to education, and I will read. The estimated effect of the literacy inquisition on basic education is reduced for individuals born between 1929 and 1959, and hence educated under centralized institutions compared to those educated under more decentralized arrangements. This indicates that the negative association between the literary inquisition, and the basic education is weakened for cohorts educated under centralized institutions.
Yeah, that's right. I think that is the part. I mean, the remark I eventually also had to just like to make some of the results much more fleshed out because right now, I think so. At first sight, it would be just like a general relationship between the literary inquisition and the literacy, which is right. But I do like to make it clear that there is certain conditions I like to attach to it. It is particularly true if this institution is decentralized and then organized locally. If this is either just a clan-based economy, right, when the educations were provided by the clans, or a more state-based economy, then this effect would not be as pronounced. So, for the point of view of having this just testing mechanisms, I think this is a very important thing to say. But even just we thinking about the effects of having autocracy, This is also in and of itself would be important, because I think that is exactly why I think autocracy tends to breed more autocracy, because it makes it much more attractive to have the centralized or state-driven solution.
What did people resist?
For the literal inquisitions.
Yes.
So what happened? I think on the resistance side, the obvious one, the more visible kind of resistance you saw was definitely mostly in the 1600s, when you had this Ming Qing transition. In that period, it is not that different from what every transition looked like. You'll have people who wouldn't really agree with what this the new ruler would be doing, and then there would be more of a repression and just trying to make sure they're seen as legitimate, and then crashing down some of the dissent. They also closed down the private academies, which was very common in the previous dynasty. In terms of the era when there was actually literary inquisition, I would say this is already a time there's very little visible um, revolts or any attempts to oppose this region. So it was more like a preemptive attack. So it's more like the ruler believed there could be future revolts if there is those ideas spreading around and not being controlled. And in order to prevent that from happening, right? So I will make sure those ideas don't exist. I'm not sure if it will exist or not, so I will just take a guess. So that if there's any signs or any traces, any possibility that these ideas exist, and I will, I mean, for the rulers, right? I will make a move and making sure they don't survive. So that is, I don't know if what would you think of this in the conceptual terms. To me, this is not a so this is not like a response to existing threat. This is more like a response to future threat. And so it would be hard to. So simply put, it would be very difficult to see how you resist this, because the attempts, the Inquisition itself, is not really based on any any current threats. It is driven by a concern over future threats. So
Treated.
yeah, so it would be surprising to me if people are able to push back on this type of inquisitions.
Apparently, the state was able to exert autonomy over its subjects for a long time in order to keep them pacified.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you have, this goes back to the social capital point. So by this point, like the population is already quite autonomized, right? So this is like after about 700 years of imperial exams. So what imperial exams does is it breaks down the bonds between people, because they don't really need to rely on each other anymore. So the very act of just taking the exam is a very personal thing. People just needs to be good at school, and then they will get certain outcomes, like being a good, successful bureaucrat, for example. So by this point, I would say that it is already, it's already quite favorable conditions for the state. I think so. There's different ways to pacify the people. One way is to constantly like put people in the prison and like to just deal with all this moving, a lot of dissatisfaction or discontent. Another way to do this is to bribe them, almost, so you bribe them with material benefits and everything. And then I think the imperial exams is neither, but it's sort of like it's sort of like an institutional innovation in a sense. Like it provides some satisfaction, and it gives people some hope and thinking that they are like paying an effort and working for some worthwhile goals. So that's how the society was structured. So that would be the main source of stability for all the imperial Chinese regions. The only thing that is different for the imperial, the Qing dynasty, is that they are seen as the outsider, right? So they don't really enjoy the same kind of legitimacy as before, and that's what made them much more repressive than ever. And is even is going further to take away the only like remaining autonomy those intellectuals enjoy. Let's Yeah. So let me summarize this a bit more. So just a quick recap. So what happened is in the earlier period, like, most of these people, like, the elites are gone. The elites are no longer there because they were not tolerated, and the intellectuals or or being brought in, right, through this examination system to replace the elites. And then by this point, the intellectuals had also no political power anymore, but they still had some autonomy. They still get to like get enjoy some of this freedom to express their ideas, do their writing, some poetry. And it is only by the Qing period that then there is an increasing level of the repression. Partly is because driven by the concern of not being seen as the rightful owner of the country. Right? So the ruler has had to, like, for his point of view, has to taken even more rights away from these people, the intellectuals. So it's a gradual process, but I do think the last stage made a big difference because it made it impossible to be safe under the old conditions, and it has to engage in active self-censorship and to keep their needs like to the very minimal. If there's any left, I would think there's actually very little. Very little is still being allowed to. So people would just be to trying to say as little as possible, and try not to having any visible presence if they don't need to. So that is where I think there's a fundamental change in like the collective personality of this both the intellectuals and anyone who can possibly become intellectual. Then this is really a very large segment of the society.
All right then, Melanie, and the research gets more interesting. Did the literary Inquisition foster tolerance for authority or repression?
Yeah, so this is like a common. It's almost like a view. I guess I would say not necessarily people who study autocracy, but observers of autocracy or people who thinkers of autocracy or a democracy often has this view that people get converted somehow into believing in autocracy. So I don't find this at all. I think part of this results says like the exact opposite. People don't change their intrinsic beliefs. This might be harder to 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 accept, right? In the sense of these people do know what they want, but somehow they just decide to suppress it for their own safety. So it's true, it might be against some of the higher ideals, but this is what reality is. So I think this is like a nice thing about the empirical research, which is I show that this is what they chose to do. They have encountered the threats. The alternative will be have themselves and their family being destroyed, and they have decided not to pursue this path, but instead and to be in a safe position. At the same time, keeping their their beliefs about what society should be like, which is not to be like an autocratic world. I think that's how I would be reading these results. So there is no sign that they actually been truly converted into believing that autocracy is the natural way of organizing society or the country. They might as well believe something very different. It's just that they would choose not to express it. That's why their beliefs no longer matters, right? This is results to the other outcomes or the implications that I wanted to drive this paper towards, which is what the Inquisition did was not really to change people's beliefs about autocracy necessarily, but it leads to a like selective turnout, and people who have those more progressive values, not as likely to express them as a result of those past traumatic experience.
But Melanie, you do say, I find that individuals in prefectures with a legacy of the literary inquisition are more likely to think that people like themselves do not influence decisions made by government. So are they also skeptical of democracy? Because it sounds like they tend to repose confidence in the power of the autocratic system to exert control. So they're less open to ideas related to democracy.
I see. So that's how you read it. I guess I cannot rule that out, but here I think the most obvious thing from this answer would be that they don't think participation matters or can change any outcome. So this could be also a sign of a pessimism. Wouldn't read it as they don't believe in democracy though. So for one, there is no democracy whatsoever even in the modern day China. So it would not be a directed like you can possibly interpret it to be having less trust in democracy. So for another is I think this is just for the way I read it is that they just don't have as much of a passion or idealism about the prospects of being able to influence any stages of the policy making at all.
Your conclusions are reinforcing your thesis, social capital decline. That's why they don't have enough confidence in the government and institution. They think that their opinions don't matter to the people in power. So it's a society that's
That's
low in
right.
civic
Yeah,
capital. And
that's right. Yeah. So combine these two, I would say like even just on the left, if it's just the results on the left panel of this table, I think you're looking at the page 35. Even just looking at their view towards how likely they can influence the policies, it's still not all the way clear. But if we combine this with also how they react in those more local level organizations, which arguably is not part of this autocratic government, then I think it is pretty clear they have lower civic capital because apparently they also less likely to engage in their own communities.
yes, and as you say, individuals in affected prefectures trust less and are more disengaged from politics.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So your conclusion has reinforced your thesis, but the last conclusion is quite interesting, and I'm going to read it. Additionally, autocracies can provide order and public goods when social capital is low. And for this reason, autocratic rule can have appeal in societies with low social capital. Hence, by reducing social capital, autocracy can introduce a vicious cycle that favored its survival and persistence. What an interesting feedback mechanism.
Yeah, I think that the effects on the education is actually a very good example or illustration of this mechanism. That's what the main thing I have in mind. But there is obviously this other route for autocracy also to reinforce itself, which is through the political participation side. But let's come back to the education side for a moment. So the results on education is actually much more generalized than it is currently. Because right now we focus on education as one of the local public goods, but it can really be any local public goods. So anything that is also that could be supplied um, decentralized in a decentralized way or by based on a more bottom up approach, but can also be supplied in a centralized way by the state. Then whenever there is already a dampened and a reduced amount of the social capital, it's always going to favor the state-led approach. So then I think if the goal is to have the state, especially the autocratic state, to increase its control of the society, then it seems it will be always be favorable if they can weaken the civil society first. And here I think I'm just showing that once they do this, then it is almost like an automated process. Or in other words, there is a long-term payoff to this one-time um, intervention to the local society. There is a very, I mean, it's like there's a lot of reason for the autocracy to do this, and but obviously for the civil society, there's a lot of reason to be worried about this. So there is there's hidden effects that it goes on for a lot longer than its temporary impact on the society.
So Melanie, excellent responses. We're wrapping up, but before we do so, Melanie, I'm going to encourage our readers to check out your paper titled for it was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Folklore Editor's Choice, and your co-author is Stelios Michaelopoulos. I really like this paper because I'm able to identify its applications to countries outside the West. So let me comment on it briefly. So in Jamaica, there's the Anansi story. So Anansi is a trickster. And in the Anansi story, is successful. And as you said in your conclusion that in countries where the tricksters are not punished, people are more likely to trust less and tolerate corruption and inefficiencies. So I am applying that story to the Caribbean because in the Anansi story, he's always a winner. And he's a trickster.
Right.
Are you familiar with Anansi?
No, unfortunately not. But I can totally see that, that kind of a story because I have some idea about like within Europe variation in this as well. But yeah, so I'm glad you find it to be of some explanatory powerful and local oral traditions in your society.
Yes, that's why I like it, the Anansi story. Like Anansi is always winning and he's really devious. For some people, they think that Anansi is just a joke. We shouldn't take him seriously. But I argue that we ought to assess the situation more broadly because in Jamaica, people do think that if you follow the laws, you're going to be punished. One politician said that the man who plays by the law is shafted. So I think that the implications for a country like Jamaica are clear.
I see. Do you know this where this oral tradition, like what it's held emerged in your case? This is more of a local indigenous
You know,
stories
it's
or
from
was it
Africa, it's from West
historical?
Africa.
I see. Okay.
Many of the
Yeah, yeah.
slaves who ended up in Jamaica, they came from the Gold Coast, Asante Empire,
Mm,
and their descendants, the Bight of Biafra, Dahomey, Benin, those places in Africa.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. So that is very that's yeah. So this reminds me about how we dealt with some of these populations in Latin America because it's often have to join like several different oral traditions. As well as the Spanish tradition, but also the indigenous tradition and the African traditions. But yeah, so I do think those stories are quite common like in those areas you mentioned. Yeah.
I think that Jamaica is an excellent testing ground for some of these theories, not just your ideas, but other ideas. A really
Yeah,
brilliant
yeah.
testing ground. More people should study Jamaica.
Mhm. Well, we will have you already, so
Yes, all
I
right.
guess.
Okay. All right. You're right about
Okay.
that. But speaking to you has been a pleasure, Melanie, and we'll talk again via email.
All right, sounds good. And
All
thank
right.
you for interviewing me.
Yes.
I think I very much enjoyed the
Me
conversation.
too.
Mhm. All
Brilliant
right.
economist. Bye.